Welcome to another episode of Israel at War. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I have with me today a recurring guest who I'm very pleased to have. Again, Michael Berenbaum. He's director of the Sigi Ziering Institute and a professor of Jewish Studies at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, and many other things besides author of many, many books. But today we're going to be talking about Israel at War. And what I just asked Michael about before we start is the fact that commentators in Israel on the news in English broadcasts have been talking about the fact that Israel's fighting in 7 or 8 fronts. And Michael's going to start by discussing that and political and military implications.
Well, let's begin with where we are at this moment in time.
Okay.
And we can talk about the multiple fronts in which Israel is fighting. Israel is clearly in a surrogate war with Iran. It's in a battle with Hamas in the south, with Hezbollah in the north. It's in a battle with the Houthis in the area surrounding the Red Sea. It's in a battle with Syria on the Golan Heights, and it's in essentially a battle on the Western Front in terms of the perception of Israel. And it's also in a cultural battle at this point of delegitimation. And we've seen that manifested in a couple of cultural elements. University of Minnesota just last week apologized for the behavior of one of its journals, which refused to consider a submission by an Israeli scholar. Now, that's a cultural boycott without considering the merits of what one published. And you just told me the story about an Israeli novelist who was going to speak on her literature. And before she was asked to speak, she was asked what her perspective is on the war, which means that she's being asked for political opinions in order to qualify or disqualify for a speech at the University of London. And Israel has a PR war, which it is, by all accounts, dramatically losing support. It's also losing political support in terms of the recognition of a Palestinian state and the like. But let's go to the two elements that interest me the most at this moment. Number one is the political element. On Friday, interestingly enough, on Friday after Shabbat had begun in Israel, so that meant that the religious ministers could not comment on this for 25 hours. President Biden outlined what he called an Israeli peace proposal, and the Israeli peace proposal included essentially a ceasefire in exchange for the release of the hostages in a gradual form, the gradual Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and replacement by other forces, and the dismantlement, as it were, of Hamas as the governing force in Gaza. There's an interesting political storm in Israel now, combination of a couple of factors. Number one, the Prime Minister's office has indicated that he did not receive the full text of the proposal. And two of his right-wing ministers, one of his right-wing ministers, Ben Gvir, has indicated that the text of the proposal was not shown to him, and that the head of the National Security Council, Tzachbi Hanegbi, even lied about whether there was a text of a proposal. And consequently, the Prime Minister is in a situation where the United States, at least, believes that this is his proposal. He claims it is not his proposal. It is Joe Biden's proposal. The Prime Minister has been invited to speak to the U.S. Congress at a moment at which, in one sense, he's indirectly calling the President of the United States a liar. and he's being called, at least his national security uh, head of National Security Council is being called a liar by one of his ministers. And the other part of it, the equation, is that his two ministers are saying that he refused to show them the text. So we're in a political no man's land. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu is not only fighting a war, but he's fighting a battle for his own political survival. And it's unclear what he does in terms of uh, moving forward on the war front, moving forward on a proposal to release the hostages, and also gaining his own governmental survival. To complicate matters even further, Yair Lapid, who is the leader of the opposition, has said that if the two ministers, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and their parties leave the government, he will provide cover, meaning he will provide the votes to put it through parliament and not call for the downfall of the government if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich leave the government. He will cover Netanyahu's rule in such a way that they can proceed. All of this is taking place with Israel now in Rafah claiming essentially that it has basic operational control of Rafah, with at least 750,000 Palestinians having been evacuated from Rafah in something that the American government believed would take several months, and the Israeli army has proceeded to do it in 2 weeks or less, which leads to the question of how do you provide provisions for 750,000 people who are living outside of Rafah without any of the infrastructure of a city? And are you going to have what the accusations are? Are you going to have widespread famine and widespread plagues or diseases because the infrastructure for feeding the population has collapsed and the medical system has collapsed? Add to that one more factor, and just to make it to round out the equation, and if you see that we're talking about having multiple balls up in the air, you can see it, and if you're looking at me, you see hands going up and down. You're juggling multiple balls. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, has asked for the prosecution of Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Gallant, which means that they are, and they've called for a cessation of activities in Gaza. And the Prime Minister's response to that is, we will continue until total victory. But the question of what total victory represents is also up in the air. So at this moment, we have confusion, political intrigue, mutual recriminations, and all sorts of other things taking place at the very same time.
And I think we forgot to mention the West Bank.
And you're correct. We have things heated up on the West Bank. And part of that is that the settlers have regarded this as an opportunity to inflict casualties on the Palestinians and to further assert their authority in the West Bank. And some Palestinians have responded to that with acts of violence and the like. So there's a battle on the West Bank as well. How one makes clarity of this situation is, how do you juggle multiple balls and keep responding one way or the other, and the like. My sense is that, and we forgot one more thing, which is that I believe it's June 8th is the deadline that has been set by Benny Gantz in his political party for Benjamin Netanyahu to come up with a proposal for the day after, or else he was going to leave the government and the government and consequently change the composition of the war cabinet and further complicate the situation.
And also, there are two separate hostage groups, and they have, and their agendas are different. Do you want to talk about the two different groups?
Well, there's an old joke about two Jews are left on an island. At the end, they have three synagogues. What is it? But they asked them, we understand why you have two synagogues, because you can't go to the same synagogue. The question then becomes, why do you create a third synagogue? Because that's the place that neither will go. And in one sense, that's the only form of unity. The two hostage groups are those who want to prioritize the hostages and those who believe in a very deep way that the hostage situation is an obstacle to Israel's triumph against Hamas and want the war to be pursued aggressively despite the hostage situation and go to its final conclusion. Again, both of them speak out of personal grief and sacrifice and pain and anguish and everything else. But all of this is part of the circumstances that we face at this very confusing, very difficult moment.
So, if you had a crystal ball, what do we need to do?
I think we need several things. Number one, we need to understand that this is a multi-complex situation, which is not going to lead to an easy resolution, that clarity is not available, and that there have been multiple signals from the prime minister and great and profound divisions within the government that at this moment don't seem likely to be bridged. So we're in a confusing political time. We're in a two-faced situation with the prime minister, who's trying to both keep his American ally happy, trying to do something with regard to the hostages, and trying to keep his own right wing within the government, and facing a political rival who has given him a deadline to do something he has deliberately not wanted to do. At the same time, he's got the element of coming to the United States, speaking to a joint session of Congress at a point in which he doesn't have the support of his own citizens. And equally important, the question becomes if he's going to use that as an opportunity to attack the President of the United States within months of an election in the United States, and use that to polarize and politicize support for Israel within the United States. And all of this is in a situation in which there is obviously a significant increase of anti-Semitism and a significant decrease of support for the policies of the Israeli government. So making sense of it, I guess the only way to make sense of it is to see the various forces at work and the various agendas of the various forces. I want to say that I think President Biden has been, as it were, at this moment on the side of the angels, meaning that his support for Israel, most especially during the period of time in the attack by Iran, his support for Israel was significant. Israel also received support from Great Britain. Britain is going to undergo an election within the next couple of months on July 4th. So it's within a month, in essence, a month and a day. and the Labor Party, which looks like it's going to win, has a different range of support for Israel than the Conservative Party. But Israel also receives support um, from Jordan at the same time, and indirect support from Saudi Arabia. So President Biden is trying to get a ceasefire and is trying to use this. Every crisis is also an opportunity. And the opportunity President Biden is trying to find is an opportunity to bring a normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia in return for security promises from the United States, at the same time as Israel makes some sort of gesture toward the Palestinians that may be as little as a fig leaf to essentially make the Jordanians or enable the Saudis to come in to the to relations with Israel. So and also Israel's control of the Philadelphia quarter in Rafah complicates its relationship with Egypt, though Egypt has no desire to draw close in any which way, manner, or form to the Hamas leadership in Gaza. Excuse me for 1 second. Let me just shut this down.
The Philadelphia corridor is the one that's right next to Egypt, south of Gaza, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's right. That's right next to Egypt.
Exactly. And there's been a lot of, back and forth that Egypt won't allow humanitarian aid to enter Gaza through Egypt. So there's that pressure too.
Yeah, look, the Egyptians regard Hamas as their enemy because Hamas supports Muslim Brotherhood, which is the enemy of the Egyptian government. And in normal context, an enemy of my enemy is an ally. And consequently, it sees itself, for better or for worse, in alliance with Israel. Though, again, that's the government, whether that's the street, is a different story.
Now, what I'd like to talk about is a very micro level at the moment. What individuals can do. I'm going to tell you what I've been doing without success recently. I have been emailing or through LinkedIn every time I hear an Israeli spokesperson give the daily briefing, because I just think that saying, so I have a marketing and writing background, for those of you who don't know me. Every time they say, bring back the 129 or whatever the number is today, hostages, that's not strong enough. I would put a picture each day of a different hostage before the questions, after the briefing, before the questions, hold out one picture, different one every day, and talk about that person for a minute, 2 sentences. Make the hostages real people. And here's the other thing 2 other things I've been emailing the briefers about. Every time they talk about how many tons of food and humanitarian aid gets into Gaza, I would say, and does any of this food and medicine reach the hostages? So that would be another way I would. And the third thing is that all of us need to be careful of how we explain things, because Ilan Levy, who I think is terrific, when in a briefing recently, wanting to say how few Jews there were in the world. So I'm sure, Michael, you know the number, I don't. So-and-so millions. But, people hear the word millions. It sounds large because it's got, I would say, and again, Michael, you probably know the number, I don't. The percentage of Jews in the entire world is it 0.1% or 1%? I would give the percentage. That's much stronger picture. So I think all of us, this is my pitch, Michael might not agree, we need to be very clear on how we're presenting information in the way that people take in information.
Look, I think that if you're asking how Israel's behaving on the PR front, you have to say a couple of things. Number one, the military spokespeople have been terrific, and they're generally competent, they're accurate, and they're informative. The problem is not from the briefing side. The problem is that the divisions of Israel are manifest all over the place and the different pulls. So I'm on the college campus arguing that Israel is not a colonial enterprise, and there is a rally in Israel to colonize Gaza again. Remember, Israel left Gaza in
2005.
2005, or I believe it was 2006.
I
But
was there the weekend that they pulled out in 2005. That's Sidgerot. Mitch and I were there watching them. So
2005. So consequently, Israel had no colonies there, no settlements there, et cetera, et cetera. Deliberately did that under the assumption that, and again, Sharon's assumption was clear, which is he was relieving Israel of any responsibility for 2 million Palestinians, which changed the demographic makeup. Because if there are 5 million Palestinians, 2 million in Gaza, 3 million in the West Bank, you get rid of 2 million, you change the demographic relationship between Jews and Arabs for a significant period of time. And he was withdrawing that in a very basic way, which is fine. And that's indeed what happened, hoping that Gaza would use this as an opportunity to become a manifest example of Palestinian self-government. 2007, Hamas overthrew the Palestinian leadership, and consequently became a subject of attack. Imagine, for example, in an American context, if we received rocket fire from Mexico and from Canada, which is what's experienced to Israel, and if 200,000 Israelis, and Israel's population is um, is uh, 10 is 1/35th of America's population, meaning that essentially, if America has 350 million roughly, and Israel has 10 million, so it's 35 times the American population. That would mean, and if 200,000 Americans were the comparable equivalent of 200,000 Americans, it would involve 35 times 200,000 is 7 million Americans were displaced from their homes because of rocket fire from Mexico and Canada. Imagine how vulnerable America would feel, how angry America would feel, how victimized America would feel, and consequently, how you begin to see what happens in these circumstances.
that's another thing that I think I've emailed. Every time they talk about displaced Palestinians in Gaza, we need to remind people of how many Israelis have been displaced in Israel since October 7th.
Yes, but as we remind them, the problem with Israel reminding them is it's reminding its own citizens of
Mm-hmm.
complete failure of what Israel was established to prevent, and also of the sense that Israel was the guarantor of Jewish security. So we have to face that element
Mm.
in it, which is one of the reasons why it is not stressed as much, because how do you say we bloody failed at the most fundamental mission, which is keeping our citizens safe?
Good point. Good point.
Frightening point, terrible point, but accurate point.
So, is there, I mean, in your personal opinion, unless you don't want to give it, do you think that it was really an Israeli proposal that President Biden announced on Friday, or did he just say that for whatever reasons that we won't try and?
I don't believe for a moment that the President of the United States would have announced that it was an Israeli proposal without the consent of Israel. I think Israel is saying one thing to the American government, which it's reliant upon. And remember, if Israel has an eight-front war, it's going to be reliant on American weaponry for the foreseeable future. You cannot create a military industrial infrastructure to handle that burden um, uh, without a 5 to 10 year buildup. And I don't believe that the president would have made such an announcement without having Israeli consent. Mm. And I believe what they're doing now is to nibble at the edges to get a little bit of wiggle room. And it could be that essentially Israel both welcomes and fears that pressure. Or let me put it to you this way, the prime minister both welcomes and fears that pressure because it may be the only way out at this moment. I don't know this. I'm speculating. This is an opinion. I could very well be wrong, but it's not my experience that this president of the United States would go that far out on a limb without having had a clear go ahead from Israel. And it's also possible that Israel's attacking some of the fine print and therefore says it's not quite the proposal we received, but it certainly was the outline that was received. And again, we have to see the president doing an awful lot, going out on a political limb to try to achieve something quite significant. He's going big. He's not going safe. I mean, and he's going big, and the achievement, if it was to be achieved, would be major. So, and remember, let's go back to 1973, and remember Henry Kissinger, and in that sense, Richard Nixon did not allow Israel to achieve a complete victory over Egypt, surrounding the army of Egypt and making the army surrender. Israel was within miles of Cairo, and they withheld that because they thought that a standoff would force both parties into reasonable negotiations that then led 4 years later. It led 4 years later to Sadat going to Jerusalem. So there is a precedent for America forcefully entering the fray at one point, not militarily, but diplomatically, and forcing an imposition. And that ended up being much to the benefit of Israel, far more than might have been a complete defeat of Egypt in 73.
Right. Although I would argue it's one thing that your adversary is another country that's not a designated terrorist organization.
There are many differences, and I'm not saying that the Hamas is essentially a religious political organization. And the problem with religion is that if you think that God is on your side, you cannot compromise and you cannot make political decisions. And Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. It used to call for the attack on Jews alone, but it modified it, quotation marks, in regard to only the Zionist entity. They don't even want to use the word Israel. So consequently, we see all of this at the same time.
So to end this very upbeat interview, I'm teasing you a little. What would you like to say in closing?
You know, I'm beginning to believe that it's like the weather. You know, hold on a while, the weather will change. The reality is that the object circumstances of what's happening will change, and will change rapidly, which is why it's so, on a combination, so newsworthy and so fascinating. and so problematic. The underlying issues will not change. And the underlying issues are that Hamas must be defeated. What that looks like, we do not know. The hostages, who are fewer and fewer as the time goes on, face gruesome conditions, and who knows how many of them are still alive. And that Colin Powell's notion of the Pottery Barn's rule that if you break it, you own it, is also present, which is Israel now owns Gaza because it broke Gaza. And how it manages that is going to, in one sense or another, determine their role in public opinion. All of this does not lead to an easy, a clear, or a happy situation. Sorry, I cannot be more upbeat. I'm happy that you're involved in grassroots action. And that's very important. But this analysis could be overcome by news if I turn on the news in an hour.
That's true.
But
That's true.
we do not know. But the underlying factors will not be overcome within an hour. They're going to be with us for quite some time.
So, as always, first I thank Michael and I say, and we'll hopefully hear from him again in a couple of weeks because his insight is always, while not uplifting, very enlightening. So, I thank you very much. Be
You're welcome.
well.
Thank you.